Warning, we are not your attorneys. Please, don't take anything we say as legal advice. I'm Jeff.
I'm Mike.
And I'm Derek.
And you are listening to the Not So Grand Jury,
which is now sponsored by Morwa P. LLC.
We're joined for this episode by Andrea Fenster of the ACLU of Virginia. Andrea focuses, as it happens, on prisoners' rights, which are very appropriate for this discussion of Shawshank Redemption. So, Andrea, why don't you introduce yourself, and in addition to what I already did, and tell us a little about what you do.
Yeah. So my name is Andrea Fenster. Like you said, I am with the ACLU of Virginia. I am a Prisoners' Rights Done Legal Fellow. Before I came to the ACLU of Virginia, I've also done work with the Prison Policy Initiative up in Massachusetts. And I've dedicated a lot of my time and my work to prisoners' rights work, and a little bit also on related issues, criminal legal issues, a little criminal defense sort of sprinkled in there. And I'm super excited to be here chatting with you all today.
Well, we're very excited to have you, especially on this. So that you're aware, I've done a little bit in the prisoners' rights area, particularly over the last couple years, but really only one case. And I don't think Derek or Mike have delved into that space at all. So you're really our expert here. And I'll chip in where I have stuff to add, at least on that issue. We'll talk about a few others as well. But like I said, we're very happy to have you.
And thank you for joining, Andrea. I believe your colleague, Matt Callahan, is one of Jeff and my friends through the Jessup competition that we have been a part of for years. So, and he highly recommended you, and also said you were terribly excited to talk to us about this, which is even more fun. So we're excited to have you. And this would be a fun conversation with you and Jeff running the way and me just sort of steering the ship behind the scenes, I have a feeling. So, Mike, have our plot summary of the, I'm sure a lot of people who have listened to this, I'd like to think have seen Shawshank, but if they haven't, give a great overview.
Well, if they haven't, they probably should. So Shawshank Redemption came out in 1994. It's based on a Stephen King novel. Rita Hayworth and Shawshank Redemption is a novella published in different seasons, which is a couple short stories that Stephen King put out. It follows Andy Dufresne, who is wrongfully convicted of murder, and follows him and his struggles in prison for about 2 decades before he finally escapes. Today we're going to focus on a few of the relevant legal topics that we took note of, including corruption, abuse of power, civil rights issues, Eighth Amendment issues that may have popped up, and a few other just notes that we thought were interesting.
Might have popped up a little bit of Eighth Amendment.
All right, well, whatever really got our interest in this one.
Just a pinch of Eighth Amendment violations.
Do you want to start with that?
Yeah, which one?
Sure. Okay. All right. So I mean, I suppose one of the most prominent ones would be like the prison beatings that takes place, and this ties into my topic for the corruption and abuse of powers, where who played the guard? It was
Clancy Brown. Fantastic performance.
Yeah. Amazing Clancy Brown, amazing voice. Clancy Brown is a disgusting, sadistic prison guard who brutally beats several of the prisoners.
It's kind of our introduction to life in Shawshank.
Yeah,
I mean, we're introduced to him literally murdering one of the brand new, inmates. That's how it starts.
Yeah. And it just starts with the most casual beating because somebody was he crying at the beginning of the movie? And
he was crying.
Brown just beats him, leaves him convalescing on the floor, doesn't get a medical aid, and he dies, which I think is almost a classic 1983 claim.
Please, I ain't supposed to be here. Not me.
I ain't gonna count to 3. I'm not even gonna count to 1. You will shut the fuck up or I'll sing you a lullaby.
Man, shut up. It's been a mistake.
And it's so egregious too, because he's sitting there at the bar saying like, I don't belong here. He's crying. Like, this is his first night in prison, which is like particularly traumatic. You've just been like ripped from your home and you are surrounded by this loud place with metal and cement everywhere. And prisons are really this sort of, they're their own community. And you've been just sort of like dropped there with nobody you know and nobody around you that you know. And he's really just like, oh gosh, it hurt my heart because this guy was clearly going through it. And the only response that the prison guards had was to beat him. They didn't say like, you're fine. They didn't say like, of course you belong here. Like they said like, shut the F up, and they beat him. And like the really sad part too is like, I wish I could say that never happens. Right. And like the next day when they're, all sitting in the chow hall and they like ask what happened to him. And the guy is like, oh, the doctor just never showed up. And so he bled out essentially, or like his head injury, he died because of his head injury.
Hey, Tyrell, you pulling infirmary duty this week? How's that horse of mine doing anyway?
Dead. Hadley busted his head up pretty good. Doc had already gone home for the night. Poor bastard laid there till this morning. By then, hell, it wasn't nothing we could do.
Like, it wasn't that long ago that I was on the phone with someone who told me like a really similar story about, we work in the prisons in Virginia, and right now there's a major staffing shortage in Virginia and around the country for prisons. Because to be honest, they're just not a fun place to work. I mean, they're really awful.
But they pay great.
See, you would think that, but I was actually doing some research and I was like, oh my gosh, I make more than that. And I work in nonprofits.
Right. Yeah. To be clear, that was sarcasm for the listeners. I know Andrea got it. But...
it was like a relatively high up guard too. I found his salary on some open record stuff, but yeah, and I was on the phone with someone who was telling me that because the prisons are so understaffed, this guy was having heart problems and he was calling out for help. The whole pod was calling out for help, trying to get this guy help. And apparently, according to the person I was on the phone with, one of the guards said, there's nobody in the infirmary. It's late at night. He's not going to be able to get help till morning. And within an hour, he was gone. And what's hard about that too is that we heard about it and we have no way of getting in touch with the family to know what happened, to tell them here's what we heard, maybe you should sue. But we know that this horrible thing happened, and making matters even more complicated for listeners that don't know, a lot of people in prison don't go by their real names. They use nicknames. They'll use sort of mononyms. And so finding out someone's real name, even if we could find them, is also really hard.
Yeah.
Yeah. So when I saw that, I was like, oh, that just hit me out. It was so real.
So even before we get any further, I just want to ask sort of the overarching question, because obviously Shawshank is, portraying, prison in the 40s, 50s, 60s. It doesn't sound like it's gotten any better based on what you're saying.
I would wager this is a kind representation of what prison was like in the 40s through the 60s.
Yeah, I'm a little skeptical to say that it hasn't gotten any better than that.
I mean,
I think that it's probably...
Maybe certain aspects have, but it doesn't sound like overall it necessarily has.
I don't think Section 1983 claims were a thing back then, so I don't think you even had the option to sue for these kind of violations, so I don't know how that would have even...
They were available, but it wasn't until basically the 1960s that the Supreme Court laid down any sort of real standard for how you hear these claims and what limits there are on prison officials' actions.
Interestingly, so I was doing some research to look that up, because I think the way I would describe it, I should add that I have visited several prisons in California. I visited death row. I have visited like solitary confinement in California. I have also visited a lot of our clients. So I have seen some prisons and jails. I also at one point taught legal research and writing up at a prison in Maryland when I was in law school. And I think,
Interesting.
yeah, I think the way I would describe it is different. They're like, prisons are much more high tech, I think, than the movie portrays. Like, the doors are all automatic doors. A lot of them, especially in solitary, are like metal doors that just slide open. It like almost feels more sterile. There's a lot less things, and it's usually like, yeah, like I feel like the movie just portrayed it as like kind of dingy. And the way I would describe it, I mean, certainly it's possible that at other prisons that I haven't been to, right, there are many, but the way I would describe it is, yeah, like sterile, more technologically advanced. Like, it's kind of wild to me, like, and more security. There are way more Sally ports in prisons now than they show in Shawshank, which, if you don't know, a Sally port is like a 2-door system to ensure that like people don't just like run straight out through a door. And correctional centers, and I call them centers because they are really just like massive campuses a lot of times. They consist of many, many, many buildings with several blocks in each building with, you know, several of them are housing, but then there's also like administrative buildings. There's all sorts of buildings. And that was, I think, the other thing that really struck me was like, yeah, that they're more sterile. And I think in some ways actually like worse than they portray.
By the way, by no coincidence, I have now opened up my bottle of Angel's Envy, just for the record. So it has nothing to do with what we're talking about, and it's not like we're starting off real good, but just for the record.
Oh, I should have bought a bottle of like 19 Crimes wine just to have for this episode.
That'd be funny. All right, I guess jumping to the next topic, guards engage in illegal activities such as smuggling contraband and accepting bribes. Red runs a little bit of a business throughout all of it. Kind of enjoy the business that he had running on the side, and like some of these things exist even today.
There must be a con like me in every prison in America. I'm the guy who can get it for you. Cigarettes, a bag of reefer, if that's your thing, a bottle of brandy to celebrate your kid's high school graduation, damn near anything within reason. Yes, sir, I'm a regular Sears and Roebuck. So when Andy Dufresne came to me in 1949 and asked me to smuggle Rita Hayworth into the prison for him, I told him, no problem.
There's, you know, every once in a while there's stories in the news about a prison guard being implicated with a gang or something.
I think that was one of the parts that was most funny to me is I was like watching them like do all of these gymnastics to get it in through the laundry and then pass it out. And I was like, the guards will give it to you. Like the guards.
Yeah.
You know, not always, but like, I think that they were going through a lot of gymnastics when like the truth is like what we have heard over and over and over again is
especially in the 1940s, 1950s, they're not searching the guards when they come in. You bribe the guard. He does the work for you.
Oh, absolutely.
One of my best friends used to work as a therapist at Rikers Island. She had stories about how like one of the other therapists showing up with little paw print tattoos, and they would ask her, you know, Julie, why do you have blood tattoos on your arms? And Julie would say, oh, they're not blood tattoos. They're little paw prints for my little cats. And it turns out Julie had joined the Bloods.
Wow.
I wanted to add something because I thought it was a really interesting point if we have the time.
Oh,
and
we do.
We have as much time as you
want.
Perfect. Okay. I will admit to you guys that I was putting together an outline. I was like issue spotting. I was taking notes throughout the movie. My outline is, yikes, 22 pages long right now.
Yeah, we're not getting all that. No, we're trying to make this a half-hour podcast.
And what I'll tell you is, listen, we can always have a part 2 or 3 at some point. So if we ever want to come back to
we
it,
can rewatch. Yeah,
we can always talk more.
Yeah, if you, I mean, I have everything in here from like First Amendment claims to like different varieties of Eighth Amendment claims to like prison food, prison mail, Turner versus Safley, because there was this really interesting part where Warden Norton, he was saying, you know, like, I'm going to keep writing letters or whatever.
Budget stretched thin as it is.
I see. Perhaps I could write the state senate and request funds directly from them.
As far as they're concerned, only 3 ways to spend the taxpayers' hard-earned when it comes to prisons. More walls, more bars, more guards.
Still, I'd like to try, with your permission. I'll write a letter a week. They can't ignore me forever.
Sure can. But you write your letters if it makes you happy. I'll even mail them for you. How's that?
They can ignore you all they want, but I'll even mail these letters for you. And I was like, that's a First Amendment, right? Like, you have to mail those letters, which is like ironic because now they actually, like, people really don't trust prison mail systems, and there's like a lot of issues with whether things actually get out and how long they take to get out, whether things get in. One of the problems that we're having right now and that people sort of nationwide are sort of having to deal with is there are these scanning systems that are popping up that I'm sure you guys have heard about that instead of the mail getting handed directly to people in prison, they scan it and give the person a scanned copy, which means that if they have given you documents, original like wet signature documents, you cannot send it back to them because they will only get a copy. It's also a problem if you're sending self-addressed and stamped envelopes. They will not get the envelope frequently. They'll just get a copy of the envelope, which is not particularly helpful. But the other thing I actually wanted to talk about is you all were talking about how like you imagined it would get better because there really weren't like prisoners' rights suits back in the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s. And I think there is some weight to that. But what I'll also say is that the Prison Litigation Reform Act is a terrible law. It is coming up on, I think it's 28th anniversary. It was passed, I believe, April 26, 1996. And since it was passed, the whole point of it was to decrease what lawmakers and what people generally thought of as being frivolous litigation from prisons, which is a wild premise to begin with to me. Like, it's pretty clear that there are all sorts of abuses that are happening and nobody gets to see them except people who are also in there. So that's wild, but it also just added this many really bad requirements that, yeah, I mean, I can go into like detail about like the exhaustion requirement, the 3 strikes rule, the physical injury requirements, and all of that. But I was looking at some numbers. So the earliest number that I have is in 1970. So in 1970, there were 6.2 filings per 1,000 people in prison. In 1995, there were 24.5 filings per 1,000 incarcerated people. And by 1997, so a year after the PLRA passes, there are only 15 filings per 1,000 incarcerated people, going down to a low of, I believe, 9.6 filings per 1,000 people in 2006.
And for the listeners, when you're saying filings, do you mean new lawsuits filed or court filings, which run the gamut?
So these are court filings, and these are specifically federal court filings, which is where the bulk of prisoners' rights litigation happens. So it did, like, there was sort of this, I don't want to call it a heyday of prisoners' rights litigation, but there was a significant amount of prisoners' rights litigation in the 70s and 80s, and I think that's reflected in this, like, in a lot of ways, really robust case law that has just been, I mean, severely cut down. And it means that, like, not only are we not getting as good case law, but judges, like courts, we're just not seeing the problems that are actually happening in prison.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean that those problems aren't there, but because of the barriers that the PLRA throws up over and over and over again at every stage, it makes it significantly harder to get people to listen to you. And this is particularly true when you have people who are incarcerated who don't have a lot of money. People in prison are more likely to be poor, so they're more likely to represent themselves because they can't find a lawyer, which means their complaints are also likely to not meet standard pleading requirements. And to be fair, there are some requirements to read what's called pro se complaints in a more broad fashion, but it does also mean that people who don't have legal experience, legal training, like, you know, the four of us, are being saddled with these really important rights and these important lawsuits, and they're on their own. And they have so few resources. And I can talk a whole lot about law libraries as well and how those fall short. But yeah.
I just want to talk a little bit about what it would actually require for one of these prisoners to try and enforce their rights if they were treated the way they were treated in the movie. So if it's all right with you, Mike, I know.
Yeah, go for it, sure.
So as I mentioned, I took a prisoner's rights case that I handled over the last couple of years, and thankfully it was successful, but plenty of others aren't. And I thought it would be a good idea to let's talk about what the Prisoners' Rights Act actually requires. You mentioned the 3 strikes rule. You mentioned administrative exhaustion. I know in my experience, just when it comes to administrative exhaustion, a prisoner has to, before they can file a lawsuit, completely go through the whatever internal complaint system the prison system itself has. Because they often aren't represented by attorneys, they don't have a good idea of what their complaint needs to say. If their complaint through the administrative process doesn't really match up with the complaint that they file in the lawsuit, then maybe the court will say, well, you didn't really exhaust it on this claim because in the complaint that you filed with the prison system, you raised this claim. And the going through that process can take a fair amount of time too. So Andrea, I'm trying to formulate a specific question here, but what has been your experience with helping prisoners through that process before even filing a lawsuit?
Yeah, the exhaustion part of the PLRA is one of the hardest things, and most frequently, it's one of the most frequent roadblocks, I think, in ways that are really awful, that like maybe aren't totally transparent, right? So like in theory, it seems really nice. Like, oh, of course you have to like use the prison system to, you know, submit the proper paperwork to make sure they have a chance to review it. What happens in practice is these prisons come up with needlessly complicated procedures and policies that require people to jump through hoops to get all the way to the end of it. And it's not enough for the PLRA to just attempt to use this process. There are definitely exceptions to when you have to fully exhaust, but for the most part, under the PLRA, you have to properly exhaust, which means you have to take your complaint all the way from the beginning to the very end and follow every rule, including like, I was doing research once and found some grievances that had been rejected because they used the wrong ink color. And they have super tight timelines where if you don't complain about something within 15 days or 30 days from the day it happens, it's just automatically denied. And then there goes your rights, essentially. Like, that's it. And then if you don't, like in Virginia, you have to appeal within a super short amount of time. Like, it's like 5 days. And that doesn't account for the fact that people might not have access to mailboxes. People might not have access to the actual forms that they need for, you know, perhaps some improper dating on the forms. It doesn't account for all sorts of things that happen behind the scenes sort of in prison life.
Hadley holds Andy over the edge of a roof and threatens to drop him essentially to his death.
Do you trust your wife?
Oh, that's funny. You're gonna look funnier sucking my dick with no teeth.
What I mean is, do you think she'd go behind your back, try to hamstring you?
That's it. Step aside, Mert. This fucker's having himself an accident.
You don't push him off the roof. Because if you do trust her, there's no reason you can't keep that 35,000.
Yeah. Either attempted murder or, pretty close to.
It'd certainly be an assault.
Yeah, prison guard attempting to throw a prisoner over the side of a wall. He would have to go through whatever the prison system's archaic appeal system is, if they have one, which I guess this probably took place in 1950, 1948. So probably is no actual system for that, but let's pretend that there is. And then after that, they can finally get it to the courts.
Assuming that they've done it properly. Yes, they have followed to the letter the prisoner's grievance.
And to be clear what following it properly means, I mean, at least for at least for the incarcerated individual that I represent.
I was wondering who was chained up to your basement.
Look, I didn't want them to be on camera, but right now.
Are you referring to your cats? My because client, I have further questions if they're your cats.
Well, they can't get out, so no. Yeah, they might get. No, my client was in West Virginia, and to go through that whole process, if the same thing applied to Andy, he would have to first file a complaint with his unit director or what have you, and then appeal that to the department director, and then appeal that to the warden, and then appeal that to the head of the Department of Corrections in the state capitol. Is that Bangor? And wherever. It's been a long time since I studied state capitals. And each of those, the prisoner has to appeal it within the proper time frame, and they have to be able to document when they file a lawsuit that they followed all these procedures. So they have to have a copy of every step. They have to have a copy of the record of the initial complaint, a copy of the denial, a copy of their appeal, a copy of the denial, a copy of the appeal, and present all that to the court for them to even get in the door to be heard by a judge.
And in Virginia, they can just reject some of those grievances without even giving you a response too, which is wild. It's called rejected at intake. Jeez. And if you have more than one issue in your grievance, if you're out of time limits, if you're if it's not the same issue, whatever that means, to prison guards, they'll just reject it and they won't give you a response. And then you have to appeal the rejection in a short amount of time again.
And you'd have to do that for every violation.
Yes.
And why do I feel like their requirements are so ridiculous too? You have to do within a certain time frame, you have to fill out certain forms, it's got to be a whole thing, and you have to give it to the right person. I feel like it takes any little technicality to kick it out.
Sometimes that might just be if you're making your own bureaucracy, things kind of get in the way and build up over time, and especially the incentives in a prison are probably not to have an efficient bureaucracy. They're just, whatever, duct tape and spit gets it done.
I mean, they also know that they have to do this in order to reach the courts, right?
Yeah.
And if the more they can block that, the less people see about what happens and what they're doing, particularly if you or your buddies are doing something really bad. I guess I wouldn't, loudly say it's intentional, but I certainly wonder sometimes. And I think, I think that you mentioned earlier this sort of issue with the forms. And in Virginia, there's two issues with the forms, really. There's getting a form and getting the right form. So we had a religious liberty case in prison a little while ago where he had to file a request. He was I know religious liberty is something we wanted to talk about. So,
I mean, Jeff will dive in at any moment about the religious aspect of it, and I'll just sit here and drink my whiskey and watch you two chat because it will be amazing to watch.
It so happens that just a couple days ago, I was contacted by a corrections officer, and this is to say that people within the prison system, they are not all bad actors, although sometimes it can look that way. I was contacted by a prison chaplain in my capacity as litigation counsel for American Atheists, and he had a an inmate who came to him looking for an accommodation so that he could witness the upcoming solar eclipse on April 8th, because the facility he's at is in the path of totality. And the chaplain was saying, we just want to make sure that this is a legitimate request. Is there significance to an eclipse? And I went through how plenty of atheists, particularly secular humanists, will celebrate these sort of astronomical events, whether it's the solstice or an eclipse, meteor showers, comets going by. We've scheduled things. We scheduled one of our annual conventions to coincide with a solar eclipse. It's entirely understandable that he would want to observe that. And I sent him all this information. He was very appreciative. He was just going through the motions to approve this request, and I was very appreciative that he did that. So this is not to say that all prison officials are out to exploit or abuse prisoners. I just wanted to mention that.
Totally. And I'll also say that it's not, even beyond that, not uncommon for guards to end up marrying people who are formerly incarcerated.
Interesting.
Wildly inappropriate to me. Man, that's...
Yeah.
Like all the issues of like dating someone in the workplace, except they're your actual prisoner.
Yeah. I mean, certainly if they were in prison, it would be an issue under the Prison Rape Elimination Act, or PREA. But yeah, once they're out. Anyways, so this case, it was a Satanist who was being denied his religious practices. The Virginia Department of Corrections had banned the Satanist Bible, and he didn't have access to space to perform his rituals, and he didn't have religious objects. And before they could even reach the issues of the case, it became an issue of exhaustion, of has he exhausted the prison system to exhaust this issue. And the issue was he needed to submit a religious accommodation form or religious recognition form. But the prison kept saying, we didn't receive it. And he kept writing grievances. I submitted this form. And the grievances were not enough to show that he did in fact submit that. And it was enough to at least create an issue of fact on summary judgment. But it wasn't enough to just bypass that entirely. And we had to go back and work with him to get him to actually submit a form that was recorded by the prison. So it's little roadblocks like that, making sure you're using the right process, because there are all sorts of different processes.
As long as if we want to take a step back to some of the religious stuff, do we want to talk about the warden issuing a Bible to every inmate when they came in?
Yeah.
Well,
sure.
and giving a very specific speech when they came in as what he expected of them during their time.
I believe in two things: discipline and the Bible. Here you'll receive both. Put your trust in the Lord. Your ass belongs to me.
Yeah, it's needless to say, it is not constitutional for the prison to issue everyone a Bible and then leave it to...
What about the Book of Mormon?
That too.
Makes it better.
The prison can certainly and probably is required to make copies of scripture available to prisoners if they wish to use one or have one, but the prison can't issue every prisoner a copy of the Bible. The prison also can't. There are a few moments, and maybe we should drop the second quote in, where Hadley tosses, Hadley being the guard played by Clancy Brown, tosses Andy's cell, and then the warden comes in, and Andy's holding the Bible, which the warden doesn't know has a rock hammer in it that he's using to dig a tunnel.
Pleased to see you reading this. Any favorite passages?
Watch ye therefore, for ye know not when the master of the house cometh.
Mark 13:35. Always like that one. But I prefer, I'm the light of the world. He that followeth me shall not walk in darkness, but shall have the light of life.
John chapter 8, verse 12.
Spoiler alert.
Spoiler alert! Yeah, if you haven't seen the Shawshank Redemption,
Stop
it's
listening.
like
Watch
the #1 movie on like several lists of the best movies ever made.
We also don't have to say spoiler alert for a movie that came out 30 years ago.
That's true. Don't remind me that it's been 30 years.
I was just going to watch it. Oh,
if you're listening to this and you haven't watched Shawshank Redemption, stop listening. Watch Shawshank Redemption, then come back and listen.
Take some time to like cry, and then.
I mean, have some whiskey, feel your feelings, and then come back.
Absolutely. Warden Norton comes into his cell and says, "Oh, I'm pleased to see you holding this or reading this." And they talk about like Bible verses and something that prisons cannot do is either treat certain prisoners favorably because they are exercising, because they have certain religious beliefs or share the religious beliefs of prison officials, nor can they treat prisoners less favorably for being Satanist, being atheist, being Muslim. Yet that happens all the time.
I was going to say, that was going to be my ask, is they can't, but we know they do. And I'm sure both you and Andrea can say that they do.
I actually have, this is slightly going back to what we were discussing earlier. One of the sort of subplots going on through much of the movie is Andy's relationship with the sisters, the sort of gang of just this gang of abusive
serial rapists.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah. So trying to use the right language here without being homophobic. Yes, the serial rapists going on in the prison. Andy's the frequent subject of abuse.
Right, and we should note, Red points out that this isn't a gay thing. These are the people who are available to them to exploit, and it's an all men prison. But we've talked a lot about the obstacles to getting into court. And if someone wanted to raise the issue of there's this gang operating that is abusing other prisoners, what they would have to show to the court in order to prevail on that, because it's not just a matter of, hey, this is happening. This person sexually assaulted me in, the back room of the laundry building.
It's been several years since I've read Section 1983 claims. This is the one time I really delve into prison work. But the cases that you would read, and these are just the ones that were like, weren't brutal enough to have settled outside of court ahead of time, which is how a lot of those cases are resolved. We're still like stomach turning in a way that no movie can really show. And maybe like, the repeated raping of Andy Dufresne is like about as close as you're going to get. But it would literally be, a prisoner is issued medication. They're issued a narcotic medication because it's, for whatever reason they need it. And they're given all of the pills at once. And they tell the prison staff, please don't do this. Someone's going to beat me up and steal this from me. And then I'm not going to have medication for the next month. And immediately somebody beats him up and steals it. And then the next month he says the same thing when he's given the pills, and the same exact thing happens. And it happens over and over again until the prisoner, loses an eye and an arm and like could never possibly recover from like grievous injuries from repeated beatings. And like, that's the kind of like, not only would it have to be repeated rapings, but also that the prisoner would have to notify the staff that it was repeated rapings. Please don't let me ever be alone with this person. Every time they attack me and they do whatever. And, we actually don't see Andy Dufresne do that. I presume that if he had told the prison staff, they would not have done anything. Although actually, eventually they did.
I think one of the things that I was watching this with my fiance the other night, and I was like screaming at the TV. I was like, where are the guards?
We talked about this before. You bribe the guard. He does the thing.
Yeah. But I think it's like pretty apparent, like just in no shots. They're just like not in the background at all. So yeah, I think that all of these would sort of be, it's called a failure to protect claim under the 8th Amendment.
And that's how it went for Andy. That was his routine. I do believe those first 2 years were the worst for him. And I also believe if things had gone on that way, this place would have got the best of him.
Which generally has two elements. There's a very broadly objective element that you have to show that there was a risk of an objectively serious harm. And there's all sorts of case law about like what counts as a serious harm. And then you also have to show subjective deliberate indifference, that the prison guards or the prison subjectively knew of the risk and disregarded that risk. And that is sort of like a more fact-specific inquiry, which interestingly, there's a sort of like really interesting way around it, which is if the risk is so obvious that you can infer that the prison officials, not that they should have known, but it's so obvious that they did in fact know.
Right. They could not have been unaware. Yeah.
Yeah. Which, yeah, I think this is like leaving people alone is a pretty obvious risk when you know that like prison rape is, or rape in prison is a real risk, that people are vulnerable, especially if you know that someone is a repeated offender. It seems pretty obvious to me that like leaving them alone in a room is knowingly disregarding a risk.
Mm-hmm.
But again, that requires prison guards to actually care and think that, you know, this claim is going to get out some.
Yeah.
Which is really bleak.
Well, actually, what I was actually going to say is, what I'm sort of curious about is, and I think I'm sad that I'm about to say this, like, the movie's accurate, right? Like, yeah, there's tons of claims that could have happened. Yeah, certain things happened, but I think what we're sort of getting to the point of is that this totally could have happened.
I was going to say totally could have happened. Maybe the only difference is the remedies that exist today, however minimal they are, probably didn't exist at the time in 1948.
I was going to say totally could have happened with the exception of the escape. I think that is the one part that like...
Oh, but that's the best part.
I know it is. Man. I know.
My two favorite movie and TV tropes, and I've talked before about how we need to come up with a TV our movie trope little section. I don't know if we ever named it, but my two favorite ones are prison escapes and bank robberies, which is why Andor is the best Star Wars thing ever, because it has both.
Well, and I will say, like, when I first watched Shawshank, you didn't see it coming necessarily, right? Like, and that was sort of the part of it was like, nope. You know, like there was a brief mention of the hammer much earlier on in the movie, and they did a pretty good job of not really bringing it up for the next hour and a half. And they did a great job of being like, he's going to hang himself, and that's where you're going towards. And you kind of knew something else was going to happen, but not what actually happened. And I say they do a pretty darn good job of it.
Maybe the one plot hole that I see now is like, there's no way he would fit into the warden's outfit.
They are
like
very differently built.
Tim Robbins is like 6'8" or something, and the warden, the warden who's. Do you guys know what other thing? Sorry, go on.
He's been in all sorts of. He was in Daredevil, the Netflix series.
That's what I was gonna say.
Yeah, well, I can't remember his name.
I was gonna ask, do you guys know what else he had been in that we had already done? And it was Daredevil. So,
Andrea, you said the one thing that really couldn't happen would be the escape. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, I mean, just from like almost, I guess, a geology standpoint, prison walls are not that soft. Like you can see, he like just goes and it just crumbles in front of him.
Yes, it's like the Foley guy did a lot of work to make it sound like rocks, but it's clearly drywall.
Yeah. Yeah.
People have tunneled out of prisons before, but yes, it's like exceptionally rare, and it's not going to be as easy as it looked like on that.
Yeah, and like I said, these are, I mean, massive complexes. So like the hard part, honestly, probably isn't even tunneling out. It's probably getting past the dogs, the fences, the like everything that's out there.
There is that one guy that escaped in PA, what was it, like last year, who just kind of Spider-Man the wall.
Yeah, that's true.
Did anybody see that? He just kind of, I'll find this clip. It's very funny. Yeah, I'll find this clip and put it in the Google.
By the way, for the record, Tim Robbins is 6'5". The warden is 6'2". So it's not terribly far off that he could have fit into his clothes. Just throwing it out there.
Okay.
And I guess I should be more specific technically, that I think that the Tim Robbins, Andy's escape, is the one that's not plausible, because actually something that is wildly plausible and in fact does happen with significant regularity is Red is technically like kind of...
Oh yeah. Just need to run for it.
Yeah, he leaves and he's a parole violator.
For the second time in my life, I'm guilty of committing a crime. Parole violation. Of course, I doubt they'll toss up any roadblocks for that.
Yep.
Not for an old crook like me. Fort Hancock, Texas, please.
Which escapes that are more similar to that, where, you're in halfway houses or, just generally non-secure facilities, work release facilities. Those are actually pretty common, where someone it's called like walking off, essentially.
There's a key plot point in The Wire that centers around that.
I just posted a clip in the Google Doc of this guy escaping. It's like you only have to watch the first 5 seconds of it, but he just Spider-Man's his way out.
It's awesome. Yeah, I guess I should say that if it wasn't clear, I'm quite the prison abolitionist.
We're all pro prison escapes because they're really cool.
That is quite a clip, Mike.
It's honestly less dramatic than any prison escape. Like every other prison escape is like, oh, I got to tunnel through 3 miles of shit to find out. This guy's just like, yeah, let me crawl the wall.
Oh. The other thing that was madly unbelievable, there were little things that were unbelievable, but this one is very niche, I guess. So they get this shipment of books, right? And they're all excited. They're going through the books. They're come pick them up, and he pulls out The Count of Monte Cristo.
What's next? I got here auto repair and soap carving.
Trade skills and hobbies goes under educational. Stack behind you.
Count of Monte Cristo
That's Cristo, you dumb shit.
by Alexandre Dumas.
Dumbass. Dumas. You know what that's about? You'll like it. It's about a prison break.
We ought to file that under educational too, oughtn't we?
No way. There are lists of banned books in prisons. Frequently, things that are banned are things about prison riots, prison escapes, things that are sexually explicit.
I could imagine, and this is in the 1950s when that part happens, I can imagine it's maybe not as closely monitored. I could imagine that happening 70, 80 years ago.
Well, and remind me, were those the books that were donated? Is that the ones, or?
Yeah.
So I guess you never know.
They were donated from libraries or whatever.
And there have been there have been some interesting cases about getting books directly from publishers and things like that.
I wonder how, so there is a healthy movement opposing banned books in the general discourse. And I think we all largely support that. I wonder how they feel about banned books in prisons, because I don't know if they take public stances on that or not.
Yeah, I'm kind of the opinion, if reading The Count of Monte Cristo is going to help the prisoners in any way, shape, or form through your prison security, the problem is your prison security, not the fact that they read a book from 200 years ago.
You're
When
right.
did Dumas write?
I do wonder about what was it, the Anarchist Guide or whatever. There are books about how to make improvised napalm and weapons, and maybe that's, I don't know. I don't have strong thoughts on this either way. Anarchist Cookbook, that's what I was thinking of.
I do know the book Lawman by Sean Hopwood has been banned in a couple places for things. It's not a treatise on escapes, but I think there were a couple different points where he was talking about crafty solutions to things, and that was why it got banned.
Hi everyone, Derek here with a brief message. The Not So Grand Jury is sponsored by my law firm, Morwa P. LLC. One of Morwa PLC's many practice areas is business law. If you are a business owner or someone who is thinking of starting up a new or side business, you need a legal team who can efficiently provide you legal counsel, keeping you and your business away from potential legal issues, and if necessary, representing you in any disputes that do arise. We pride ourselves on being cost efficient while also getting to know our clients. If you want less stress and more support, you need Morwa. If you would like to set up a free consult, please click on the link in the show notes, visit our website, www.mooreatty.com, that's mooreatty.com, or email us at contact@mooreatty.com. And now, back to the show.
Back to a much more fun topic of corruption and abuse. I don't know how much more there is to actually say about this other than, like, it's really fun to watch the warden's whole corruption scheme where he's making a bunch of money, and then really brutal when he has to do everything possible to cover it up, including murder. And I don't know how much more there is to say about that other than, like, there are real examples of corrupt practices on guards, probably among wardens as well, usually with organized crime. I mean, the warden would have been guilty of a dozen different things, including murder.
One question is, how realistic would it have been that someone like Andy would have been helping him, like, generally with the books and stuff, let alone with the whole, moving around funds and stuff? I'm sort of curious.
I have a question about this because, so I don't know if we're going to get into it, but one of the pieces of advice he gives is the IRS tax gift.
It's just wrong.
Mostly seems, it's bullshit, and it's probably, like, there's some speculation that he knew it was bullshit because he is a bullshit artist throughout a big chunk of the movie. So maybe that was what he was doing, just kind of bullshitting these guys to, like, he knew enough that he could give some useful advice, and he knew enough that he sounded like he knew a lot. So was that maybe making himself seem valuable?
I am not a tax attorney, nor do I purport to know anything about, I have my folder full of documents that I need to collect for taxes now that I'm too afraid to look at.
Tax law, I'm right with you. It makes me want to gouge my eyes out.
Yeah. So I do think that there is, right, like, everybody has different sort of takes on it. There are some people who want that sort of buddy-buddiness with correctional officers. We've certainly heard about cases where people report that, different gang members will be working with staff to move
contraband.
Yeah. So we've definitely heard that.
He's got his fingers in a lot of pies from what I hear.
2 years and half. He's got scams you haven't even dreamed of. Kickbacks on his kickbacks. It's a river of dirty money running through this place.
Yeah, but the problem with having all that money is sooner or later you're going to have to explain where it came from.
Well, that's where I come in. I channel it, filter it, funnel it. Stocks, securities, tax-free municipals. I send that money out into the real world, and when it comes back...
Clean as a virgin's honey powder.
Cleaner. By the time Norton retires, I'll have made him a millionaire.
There's also the other side of it where, like, people are really scared of guards and sometimes just want nothing to do with them. So it kind of depends. Like, if you work with the guards too much, you could get painted as, a snitch. So there's always, like, kind of that undertone, I guess. But yeah, there's, like, real pros and cons to getting in good with the staff, and it just sort of is like a personality thing at a certain point. A lot of the guys that we talk to, a lot of the people that we talk to want nothing to do with the staff. And I think that part of that, so I also should have mentioned that I did some work on prison gerrymandering for a little bit. A lot of prisons are in rural areas because that's where the land is. There are these huge complexes. So they're in rural areas, which means that the staff are also from the rural areas. But the people in prisons are usually from urban areas. So they don't, they're not from the same communities. And what's also fascinating to me is in Virginia, there's a lot of, these are tiny, tiny communities that have to support these massive prisons, which contributes to the staffing shortages for sure. But also it means that there are family members that are all guards. And sometimes there are even people in prison who have family members that are guards.
Wow.
It just creates these, like, really weird incentives and also, like, roadblocks where, like, if you go down into the southwest corner of Virginia, most of the guards are white. They're white. They're from the southwest corner of Virginia, and they talk with an Appalachian accent.
I didn't shoot my wife, and I didn't shoot her lover. Whatever mistakes I made, I paid for them and then some. That hotel, that boat, I don't think that's too much to ask.
I don't think you ought to be doing this to yourself, Andy. This is just shitty pipe dreams. I mean, Mexico is way the hell down there, and you're in here, and that's the way it is.
Yeah, right. That's the way it is. It's down there, and I'm in here. I guess it comes down to a simple choice, really. Get busy living. You get busy dying.
And the people who are incarcerated there are not. And I think that contributes to some of the issues with religious liberty as well. If you come from a small town that is largely Christian and you've never met a Muslim, a Jew, a Satanist, when you see them in prison, it's something totally new. And I think that doesn't help from what I've heard. It certainly doesn't.
Yeah. And, those prisoners should, are entitled to have access if Christians in the prison have a chaplain, then the members of religious minority groups are entitled to have contact with a faith leader that conforms to their faith. But you're in Southwest Virginia, and where are you going to get somebody? Because A, they're probably going to be a volunteer, and B, they have to travel from Richmond or the DC area or something. Not that there aren't other communities of religious minorities closer, but it makes it a real challenge. Because this is, much like the military, the government is sending you to somewhere where you are required to be that is not anywhere generally near where you're from. And as a result, the government has certain obligations that come with that. Yeah, there are a lot of challenges that come along with the fact that the people who are monitoring the prisoners have a completely different culture, really, than, for the most part, the prisoners themselves.
Well, and I think that dives us into, do we really want to talk about solitary confinement? Because I think that needs to be discussed.
Yeah. So I did a bunch of research into solitary confinement. Andrea, you are probably better aware of the standards, but it seems to me like the Supreme Court has never said this long is too long to put someone in solitary confinement. I imagine there are circuit court standards that have been laid down, but I haven't had time to really do a deep dive.
I think more than that, there are state laws. That has been the general trend. I believe I saw that 42 states have in some way limited solitary confinement. But I remember there was one case that I was reading where the court found that being in solitary confinement for 30 years wasn't an Eighth Amendment violation. Like was not. I mean, in Virginia, we've seen guys incarcerated. Like, that was actually one of the funny parts of the movie where I kind of snorted because he was like, wow, a month in solitary. That's the longest we've ever heard of. And I was like, I talked to someone yesterday, basically, who has been there for years. And they might not look, exactly the same, because I think solitary confinement is so sort of amorphous because prisons want to look like they're doing the right thing. So if you say solitary confinement is confinement in a cell the size of a parking lot for 22 to 24 hours per day.
A parking space, not a parking lot.
Excuse me, a parking space. Confinement in a cell the size of a parking space for 22 to 24 hours a day. All of a sudden, they're letting them out for 21 hours per day instead of, they're only keeping them in a cell for 21 hours per day instead of 22 to 24. Or they'll, instead of calling it solitary confinement, they'll call it the violators housing unit, restorative housing, restrictive housing.
Administrative restrictions.
Yeah, all sorts of things to get around, calling it solitary confinement. But yeah, certainly we've heard of people being incarcerated for years and even decades in solitary confinement. Do you want me to talk about the harms? I've got my notes all talked about.
I mean, please do, because Jeff and I were actually sort of talking about this before we even started the podcast, of just how I don't think the movie does a good job of truly explaining how awful it could be.
I don't know.
Especially
I don't know if a movie could.
Go for it.
I don't know if you could actually pick that. Sorry.
Understood, but like, well, one thing is, and the movie mentions that basically they only have one hole, is what they refer to. Like, they've got the hole, and that's where they go. I'm going to make a solid assumption most prisons have multiple areas to do solitary confinement. It's not just the place that they put the guy. And so I think that's step one. But step two is like, yeah, I get it. There's not a good way of doing it. But like, I mean, there's one time where he's in there for a month or two and they were like, I was glad to do it. Like, that does not seem like a thing from my perspective. I don't care what you're happy about. Like,
I don't care what opera you have.
I think that's what Red said at the no. Yeah, there's no way that went well.
I think it might be useful. I found a dissent that Justice Jackson wrote last November in Johnson v. Prentice, a case where the Supreme Court decided not to take it up. She's dissenting from the Supreme Court's denial of certiorari. And it's fairly long. I won't read the whole thing, but I think it might give an illustration of what solitary confinement is like. So I'll read a few choice excerpts, shall we say. And this is all a direct quote. For nearly 3 years, petitioner Michael Johnson, whom the Illinois Department of Corrections has classified as seriously mentally ill based on his bipolar disorder, severe depression, and other diagnosed conditions, was held in solitary confinement at Pontiac Correctional Center, a prison 2 hours from Chicago. During that time, Johnson spent nearly every hour of his existence in a windowless, perpetually lit cell about the size of a parking space. His cell was poorly ventilated, resulting in unbearable heat and noxious odors. The space was also unsanitary, often caked with human waste, and because Pontiac officials would not provide cleaning supplies to Johnson unless he purchased them from the commissary, he was frequently forced to clean that filth with his bare hands. Johnson was allowed out of his cell to shower only once per week for 10 brief minutes. I'm then going to skip a couple of paragraphs here. In Johnson's case, however, Pontiac officials refused... But Johnson's solitary confinement was unusually severe in another respect. In addition to the typical hardships associated with solitary confinement, prison officials completely deprived Johnson of exercise for nearly all of his incarceration at Pontiac. In the ordinary course, even when in solitary confinement, Pontiac inmates are permitted to have recreation time in the prison yard for at least 8 hours per week. In Johnson's case, however, Pontiac officials refused to provide even this modest relief. Rather, Johnson was repeatedly placed under so-called yard restrictions as punishment for various infractions, most of them minor, which resulted in the denial of any access to recreation outside his cell. Each yard restriction was imposed for a period of between 30 and 90 days, but the restrictions were stacked such that in total Johnson received over 3 years' worth of yard restrictions. 3 years in a perpetually lit cell, 24 hours a day, except for the 10 minutes you get to shower once a week. No cleaning supplies unless you buy them yourself. It's infuriating. And the court didn't take this case up.
There's actually a psychological syndrome, according to one doctor, that you can develop as a result of being in solitary confinement. And it's something that we've heard. I mean, we have a case in Virginia called Thorpe versus the Department of Corrections, Virginia Department of Corrections, challenging their what's called a step-down program. And it's essentially solitary confinement. And the things that people say happen to them after solitary, they might not have bruises. You might not be able to see it. In a lot of cases, staff violence is pretty prevalent in solitary because there's just no one around to see it. But even if they don't have physical harm, we know that solitary confinement, any solitary confinement, is associated with a higher risk of death. It shortens people's lifespans, and within the first year after release, people are at an increased risk of dying by suicide, homicide, and opioid overdose. People end up with all sorts of issues with their memory, with insomnia, truly, it causes so much harm to people. They are completely changed. And I think it's funny. I noticed, so after Andy gets out, he's sort of like curled up in a little ball. And I actually thought that was kind of fitting, because after you've been in such a small space, to be released out into the world, basically, I mean, that prison was pretty crowded. The yard was pretty crowded. I looked at it and I was like, I don't know that like a prison of this sort would normally have that many people on the yard at one time. But I think it's things like that where like all of a sudden you are coming out of just extreme isolation. You haven't seen other humans. You haven't been able to talk to people. In some cases, you don't even get any sort of entertainment. It's just you and your thoughts. And all of a sudden, there's just noises everywhere and there's so much space. It has to be intimidating to get back there. And what is also wild to me is that in some cases, actually in quite a few cases, people are just released straight out of solitary confinement. Like fully released from prison. I was looking it up and who is it? Alfred Woodfox spent more than 43 years in solitary confinement in Angola and Louisiana before he was released in 2016. Like, it's just...
So basically you have no human interaction whatsoever, even in prison, and then all of a sudden you're like, go out into the world and make something of yourself.
And yeah.
God.
And the part, not to get like too in my feelings here, but like the part that gets me misty-eyed every time I talk about it is Brooks.
I was hoping we'd have a chance to discuss.
Dear fellas, I can't believe how fast things move on the outside. I saw an automobile once when I was a kid, but now they're everywhere. The world went and got itself in a big damn hurry.
Yeah, I was sitting there like typing on my computer and my fiance was like, "Are you okay?" Because I was like ugly crying, which I should also say that I like make an effort not to watch legal shows and legal dramas on my free time, specifically because I get too invested in people.
Entirely understandable. I don't know why we do this.
So just to give the listener the background, Brooks is one of the other inmates. He's a charming older fellow who also works the library with Andy. To give, I don't know if his age is actually said, but to illustrate his age, he was talking about when he got admitted. He said it was a 1902 or something like that.
Yeah,
so
I think they said he was in for 50 years, right? Something along those lines.
Yeah, I think he was there before World War One.
Yeah.
So older man finally gets out. Maybe my one issue with the entire series there, the entire little bit, is when they hamstring in the word institutionalized, just because it seems so out of character for the characters to say. But he clearly institutionalized, gets in there, gets out, has to work as a bagman at a supermarket. Just can't do it. He's an older gentleman, just can't keep up with things, and ends up killing himself. And like, one of the sadder scenes in the movie. I remember my girlfriend was really upset when we were watching that. She had never seen the movie before we...
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Wow.
That was her first time watching it. Yeah. I specifically remember her saying, "I fucking hate this movie."
Yeah. Well, and I will say, like, he fights to even leave prison, right? And I'm assuming that that's not abnormal sometimes, right? If you've been there for that long, you don't know anything else, and then he doesn't have a terrible life there, right? Because he's been there for so long, he's doing what he wants to do, but it's also the only thing he knows, right? And the technology change, like back then, like I can only imagine what the technology change would have been if someone went into prison in the 70s and came out in 2020. God know what would have happened there, but let's imagine 1900 to 1950, same type of situation, right? So yeah, it's really sad, but also it seems very real. I mean, that's one of the more realer parts of, for me at least, that definitely really felt very real.
I typed out the whole thing because the whole thing, like literally word for word, because it was, just so poignant and real. I remember when I was in undergrad, I went to a federal women's facility and we got to talk to some of the women there. And one of them told the group how it was like her second stint, or like she had multiple stints in prison, and she got reincarcerated, but her last stint she had been in for like 10 years, and she got out And she didn't even remember to look both way when she crossed the road.
Oh, Jesus.
Both ways when she crossed the road, because there are no roads in prison.
Hadn't crossed the road and
Jeez.
Okay.
It's things like that that are just like wild to me. And there was that one sentence, I can't believe how fast things move on the outside.
Yeah.
And if you want to move on, we can do that. But there was one.
Please.
Yeah.
The part where Red says he should have died in here. It hurts so bad, because on the one hand, and it's like particularly ironic, right? Because like, with his friends or with the people who are responsible for his death. And I think it's both. And I think, it really hurts when people die in prison, but also we're not setting them up for success on the outside. There are so many collateral consequences of a conviction. And it is so hard when you get out, especially after you've been in for so long, to find a community of people, to find housing, to find a job, to just figure out what is going on in the world. After you have had years and spent years building this important community that was the only thing you knew, and now you're just, it's like the first night of prison, but the opposite all over again, where you're just dropped somewhere and you don't know anybody and anyone, and you don't have anything. You have no support system.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not true for everybody. It's not true like across the board. There are certainly people who get out, and one of our clients just got out about a week ago, and he went and stayed with his mom. So called up his mom, and I was like, hey, is your son there? And he was, which was really nice. But not everybody has that, especially people who have been incarcerated for long periods of time.
Right.
I think we've hit most of the big points. Does anyone have any individual things they want to go on about?
I'm sure Andrea's got 32 other things that she could mention if I had to guess.
All right.
But I mean, we hit the big two ones. I mean, we hit the corruption. We hit I'm just saying, like, so. Anybody got, like, what's the thing that's itching you the most? Anybody got one of those?
So I think it's worth noting that the prisoner played by Gil Bellows, who gets killed by Hadley, who knows that Andy's innocent.
Oh, yeah.
I think it's worth noting that even though he has died, his family could still bring a civil rights claim. His family could obviously bring a wrongful death claim.
Yeah, but what would the proof be? What proof would you have?
That's always
there's no video,
and also Hadley doesn't have money. Like, even the warden, who's dead by the time anyone could raise this issue.
Yeah,
Andy took all his money, so.
Yeah, would you have a claim against the state there?
Well, that's an interesting question, because you would have to show some sort of pattern and practice that the state entity was aware of or should have been aware of.
So just to give the listener the background in case we haven't. In 1960, towards the latter part of the movie, a new inmate comes into jail. Andy shows a liking to him. Turns out that inmate can testify to the fact that Andy was innocent and knows someone who had told him that he committed the crimes that Andy was convicted of.
Got me this job one time, bussing tables at a country club, so I could case all these big, rich pricks that come in. So I pick out this guy, go in one night, and do his place. He wakes up, gives me shit. So I killed him. Him and this tasty bitch he was with. And that's the best part. She's fucking this prixie, this golf pro, but she's married some other guy. Some hotshot banker. And he's the one they pinned it on.
And I think it's important I think what's important is he gave him enough facts to indicate that's got to be it, right? Like, it wasn't like he just said, "Oh, I heard some guy say he murdered a golf pro." He gives a few specific facts that make it pretty clear that he's not lying.
And then instead of taking Andy up with his information and helping him out, he arranges for the new witness to be executed. So I guess
He being the warden.
You said it was Gail. Yeah, sorry, the warden arranged for him to be executed. All right, pattern and practice that the government was aware. I mean, the problem is the warden is the government there. What other institution would he? Yeah, so it's like what other party would he? I think there actually is a good 1983 claim there. Now the problem is like, what evidence do you have of it at this point? Especially at the end of the movie, it's like,
I agree
there's no videos. Yeah, there's no videos showing why the guy was let outside of the into the prison yard. The warden is dead. Maybe Clancy Brown could tell them what happened. In which, yeah, I guess if one of the
unlikely when he's
guards,
the one
Clancy
pulling
Brown,
the trigger, but
I mean, he's already going to jail forever, so maybe he comes clean. So maybe that would be the one way that it happens. We should do more Clancy Brown movies.
He is very good. He's very good in the movie.
With Gil Bellows, we should do Ally McBeal at some point.
There we go. I did read somewhere that Clancy Brown, they had offered for him to talk to a real prison guard, like, when they were sort of getting ready for the movie, and he declined because he's like, I don't want to come out. I talked to a prison guard and then played a prison guard that's like this, and therefore they could think I got it from a prison guard. Like, I'm going to play this to what... Yeah. I'd rather to be completely fictional that I've done myself rather than it to come out that I talked to 6 guards at a federal institution and they think I'm playing them or something, right? So he really actively went away from it.
A bunch of angry men who have access to guns think that you're playing them.
Right.
I love this movie. It's a great movie.
I mean, here's what I'll say. Like, so I haven't watched it in a while. I rewatched it for this podcast, and my initial reaction of watching it for the podcast was just like, how brutal and how sad some of the things are. If anything, this conversation has made me be like, yeah, that totally could have happened. Like, not only then, but partially now. And
I'm so sorry.
But no, I mean, it says something. I don't know if nothing good, but it says something. At least for purposes of our podcast about is it legally accurate? Yeah. It might be more accurate than we care to admit.
So I guess we didn't really dig too much into that, but I mean, do you guys want to do our little reviews now?
Let me just, one note, because we've talked about Andy, we've mentioned Red a couple of times. This movie would not be what it is without Morgan Freeman in it.
I mean,
and I think I'm interested to get your all's opinion on his experience with the parole board, because we see him do it 3 times. The first 2 times are sort of this rote speech of, yes, I feel rehabilitated. And then the third one, he's very much taking stamp your form, Sonny. I really don't give a shit.
Rehabilitated? It's just a bullshit word. So you go on and stamp your form, Sonny, and stop wasting my time. Because to tell you the truth, I don't give a shit.
And he gets released. And my experience with the parole boards is severely limited to the one case I handled that tangentially involved parole boards. Andrea, do you have anything that might, how accurate is that depiction of parole? Does it really depend on a prisoner coming in and, telling a compelling story? I have my suspicions on that front, but go ahead.
So I unfortunately don't have a ton of direct experience with parole boards, but I can tell you that I've heard from a lot of people who have been in front of them. And what I've heard from them is that it sometimes just doesn't matter how many letters you present about your rehabilitation. It doesn't matter how many certificates you present and how much you talk about how you're a completely different person than the person who committed whatever crime they committed. Sometimes it's just about the crime you committed, and sometimes there isn't a great reason. And obviously it sort of varies by state, but that's certainly what I've heard, is that, yeah, sometimes it doesn't even matter whether or not you present evidence that you've been rehabilitated. It's all about what happened however many years ago. And sort of like compounding the problem is the availability in a lot of places for victims to come to parole hearings, which, if parole hearings are really about whether someone is rehabilitated or not, I don't want to say that like harm doesn't matter, but having someone who is harmed come talk about something that happened years ago, when the question is whether someone has been rehabilitated enough to go back into their community and to start rebuilding their life, it doesn't really make sense to me if it's really about rehabilitation. Yeah. So unfortunately, that's not like the greatest answer. The other thing that I will say is I find it fascinating that this could it could potentially be a lot of time that you could be, if you get denied for parole, you could potentially be staying in for a lot of time and you don't get a lawyer.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of people who are writing. I know one of my old professors, Alinda Moyd, has been writing about the right to counsel at parole revocation hearings, where they send someone back to prison after they've been out, because there's also no right to counsel, no hard and fast rule about right to counsel at parole revocation when you're being literally sent back to prison. But there's also no counsel when you're trying to prove how much you've been rehabilitated. And that just like doesn't sit right with me.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, I can talk about the victim side of things when it comes to the parole board. So, because Jeff, you're fully aware, and I'm sure Mike is as well. So, I lost my father when I was 13 years old. He was killed by a drunk driver, and the woman received 5 to 15 years. And so in New York, 5 to 15 years means she has to serve 5, and then she's up for parole at 5, 7, and 9, and then has to be released at 10. So I went to the parole, I went in front of the parole board on 5, 7, and 9, and we were the victim side of things. So we got to sort of tell our story. But they, and I think most states do this, they did separate meetings, right? So we're not near, her. So she has her own sort of, she goes in front of the board separately, but then we have the sort of victim side of things. And what was interesting from our perspective is sort of similar to what you said, Andrea, and this is all now in hindsight for me, it's kind of I appreciate that they allowed the victims to talk and that they take us into account, but at some point, that's not the purpose of it, right? And granted, I get why they have that, but what was interesting from our perspective was, as I recall, and granted, it was a few years ago, but as I recall, the big thing that the person we interviewed with mentioned all 3 times was that she never admitted to it. It was always, I still deny that I did the crime. And it was effectively implied to us there's no way she was ever going to get parole unless you admit to it, say you did it, say you're sorry. That's step 1, A, B, and C. Then you still have to do 3 more steps before they'll even really consider it. And she never admitted to it. And from our perspective, she kind of said to us, there's no way she's getting it out. She couldn't say that, but she sort of did I'm going to let you know that this is probably not going to happen. So that's the only thing I have from my perspective. And obviously they allowed us to sort of air our years of what we've done for the past 5 years and tell them what we've missed out on without our dad and blah, blah, blah. And obviously I think that was a little cathartic for us, but it was just really interesting to walk in with no context and then hear she still hasn't admitted she's done it, which was interesting.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And the only thing I'll add, because I know that you had wanted to talk a little bit about actual innocence, is the requirement. It is sometimes a requirement that you admit that what you've done is wrong. And there are certainly stories of people who don't get parole who are actually innocent and refuse to admit that they have done something wrong because they're actually innocent. And then they stay in for longer, which, definitely takes some, I think personally, if it were me at a certain point, I'd be like, I did it, whatever, please just let me out. Good for them for, sticking to it, I guess.
And if you do that and then want to bring some suit around wrongful arrest or somehow get compensated for the time you lost, if you can show you were actually innocent, you've really damaged your ability to do that when they can say, well, you said to the parole board that you did it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, of course, if you can have evidence that shows you didn't, then you can easily say, well, that was the only way I was going to get parole.
And a good lawyer like the 4 of us.
Sure.
Well, some of us. I'm not sure if Mike and I are the go-to people you would call, but
I don't call it a criminal thing. I don't want to do that.
So for any of you who are wondering, don't call
if
Mike.
you're listening to this and you are incarcerated and your First Amendment right to be free of enforced religion is violated, by all means, reach out to me. I'm happy to take those cases. And Andrea, I'm sure you're happy to take all the other ones.
And for anything else, call to
In
Andrea.
Virginia.
If you have a business issue, call me. But please don't call me about any of your prisoners' rights.
All right, guys. Are we? I think we hit all.
I
the
think
points
we've hit everything. Yeah.
Do our reviews.
Let's go. Let's jump in to see what we say about one of the greatest movies that's ever made.
All right. So Andrea, just so you're aware, at the end of every episode, we do our review of how well the movie got the law and how much we like the movie in general, and we rate it out of 9 justices. So
not jurors. To clarify from our last one,
yeah,
justices.
So I love this movie. I'm gonna give it 9 justices on how much I love it. As far as the facts and the law, one thing maybe we didn't spend enough time on this is how much Andy may have been bullshitting the tax law and advice. So I gotta ding it for that. But other than that, like the actual facts of it, the events that we see, like, are all either realistic or at least could happen. So I'm gonna give that 7 justices for how realistic I thought it was.
Let's see. In terms of quality, yes, absolutely, 9 justices out of 9. I think Mike, I agree with you on the tax question. None of us here are tax attorneys and aren't terribly interested in diving too deeply into that. But I think it's worth noting the movie opens with essentially a trial scene.
Yes, that was on my list. I forgot about that.
We didn't really get into because it's like 2 minutes and doesn't hugely matter. But there are some
the prosecution
testifies is testifying in his questions and things like that.
I mean, listen, in terms of the quality of the movie,
but I don't think it is like,
even Alito can't dissent on this one.
It's like a minute and a half of the movie.
And it's just an incredible movie.
Also,
like, listen,
man, that's the basis of why we started doing the podcast too, stuff like that.
Yeah,
but I'm gonna revise mine down to 6.
I'm still, because of everything else in the movie,
yell at the TV, that doesn't mean it's not
that we've discussed here.
Movie.
I think
so. I'm going.
Hannah ended up liking the movie.
I think
just that one scene. She's like, fucking.
Of course, there's
a 7 out of 10.
Every amazing movie has those 1 or 2 scenes that
not perfect,
you
but
hate, but you
it's
love.
Really strong.
Like one of those things. Like at least for me,
because that's what good storytelling is.
That is good storytelling.
So
it's definitely unanimous on my side. 9 out of 9. In terms of the law, like I had picked up the same thing of Jeff. The prosecution sort of testifying from the very start. The tax stuff is definitely wrong. I just don't know how wrong it is, but I know it's wrong. And so like when it comes to because here's the thing is that I think it's very accurate, but like when we look at the sort of legal side of things, the few big legal things are kind of wrong. Like I'm not saying it's not accurate, but the law stuff is wrong.
No, that's a good point.
Because that's what I kept thinking is like we went through all of our issues and like yeah, there are legal things that they could have done or should have done or whatever. It doesn't mean it wasn't truly realistic in some ways, but like the law itself, they kind of get it wrong the few times they talk about the law. I'm going down to
I agree with
4, 3. Like I'm not high up there because I think again, it's not a legal movie, right? We know it's not a legal movie.
Yeah.
It is an amazing movie that happens to get into the law, but when it gets into the law, I think it gets it very wrong. So I'm gonna go with a 3. I'm gonna say throw 3 liberal justices went in one direction, and then the other 6 of the court decided to go off into various other realms. That's my thought.
Andrea, what do you got?
I am gonna give it a 9 justices for how much I liked it, with the caveat that I will probably not watch it again for a very long time because I can't spill any more tears over Brooks. I just can't do it. For how legally accurate it is, I mean, right, like a lot of what I do is prison law, but I also do prison law in the year 2024 and not the year 1940, 50, 60, whatever. So I am going to, I think, be kind of neutral here and put it at like a 4.5 out of 9 justices because I think that it's there's a lot that at least touches on things that are very real. But yeah, there are like little things where could it have happened in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s? I don't know.
That's fair. That's fair.
The Not So Grand Jury is sponsored by Morwa PLLC.
The opinions expressed in the Not So Grand Jury are those of the hosts themselves and not of their respective employers.
The theme music for the Not So Grand Jury is from Gustav Holst's Jupiter and is in the public domain.
If you'd like to get in touch with us, if you want to suggest future movies, or even if you want to offer corrections, you can email us at notsograndjury@gmail.com or message us on any of our social media accounts.
The Not So Grand Jury is copyright 2024, all rights reserved.